Hello, in this video I want to discuss the importance of Elizabeth Macquarie in the founding of Australia as a nation. In previous videos I've discussed her husband Lachlan Macquarie and how important he was in laying out towns, laying out cities and laying out a way of life as well. For instance, through him he formalised what we now know as Hyde Park and the Royal Botanic Garden. So people in Sydney know how important and how lovely these spots are. Very important in also establishing churches and building a new community, breaking away from the English class system and setting up Australia as we know it very much. I've also been discussing architects such as his main architect, Francis Greenway, and his surveyor, James Meehan, and then later the architects Edmund Blackett and James Barnett and the profound impact that they had, and especially how they've connected to the most obvious link is Freemasonry, but esoteric or occult or hermetic, they're loose terms, but around that type of system. And it's been very much towards the male element and how these men have been important in setting up Australia. But now I want to look at the feminine side and how Elizabeth Macquarie was not just a housewife or a support to her husband Lachlan Macquarie. She was actually a driving force, a very intelligent woman, and she literally brought the books of architecture with her from England, upon which Macquarie and Greenway and then others would later depend on so much. So yes, this is going to be about Elizabeth Macquarie. Not only has a social influence, but also has her knowledge of the Hermetic system. She also practiced occult architecture and occult systems, and was had quite an impact on the design. And it's been underwritten. So I'd like to now tell her story in a way that's even most history books wouldn't discuss it. But here we see a map of Sydney and the spots of greatest influence that are not just named after her, but she actually had a very important part in the design. And so we'll begin at the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I will come back to the Sydney Harbour Bridge and explain how Mrs. Macquarie, the system that she used in her design, such as in Mrs. Macquarie's Chair and Mrs. Macquarie's Road, have a hidden code underneath them, and a code that was continued on by other architects in a later period. But beautiful Sydney Harbour, the beautiful bridge, and the Opera House, iconic, known across the world. And a short distance from so we're standing a very short distance behind the Sydney Opera House, and we have there's two sculptures here, and later again I'll get into more of. In the previous episode I mentioned how these sculptures around Hyde Park and the Botanical Gardens have a hidden system of meaning, especially connected to the story of Perseus, which we know is the clash of the Titans, and how they also have an astronomical aspect to them, forming a star chart of the northern hemisphere. One of these in plain sight secrets done in a very lovely way, artistic but also with some knowledge. But right next to these sculptures, 20 metres or a very short distance, is this Wallamai pine. Wallamai pine was an ancient tree, only recently rediscovered, thought extinct for millions of years. This is one example of the early cloned, and it's on the place where formerly Mrs. Macquarie's wishing tree is. There's a plaque in the Botanic Gardens, but earlier times people believed certain trees had spirits, and so yeah, it was a wishing tree. You would do a certain dance, and there was a poem you would recite, and this was meant to bring your wish. Now the Norfolk pine, which she planted, since died, but it was replaced by the Wallamai pine, a donation by Kerry Packer. In Windsor and Campbelltown and pretty much across Sydney, but we see these two references to gardening and to her, how she grew, how she was important in that way. And in Parramatta, the second town after the founding of Sydney, there's St John's Cathedral. And as Mrs. Macquarie was sailing away, the last church she saw was St Mary's in Rookolva. possibly thought she would never be coming back. So as the churches were being built, she asked, but if you read between the lines now, you realise that she had an impact on the design, and so these towers were on her request. But she was a very intelligent woman, and she would have had an element in their design. It wasn't just asking her husband to do the work for her. She was a strong woman. We have another connection back to previous episodes, because the original church fell apart, so that it was rebuilt, and the transepts were by Edmund Blackett, someone I've detailed a couple of episodes ago. So we have a double link to these architects and to Mrs. Macquarie. Macquarie Place in Sydney, it's a triangular park, and it's loaded with many important references. One important thing is the obelisk here. It's a 0 mile marker, and interesting to note that it's been moved from its original location. This is something which happens more often than it should, and it's a strange element. But in the obelisk and the park, the credit goes to Francis Greenway, the architect, and Lachlan Macquarie, both Freemasons. And however, there's Thomas Sutcliffe Mort statue. On that location there was a fountain there. Fountain was not just for beauty, it was like for people to get clean water. Remember, this was in colonial times, and like the old fountains in Rome, etc. It wasn't just for decoration, it was an important part of the community. Also found reference to Thomas BIgge. He was an opponent of the Macquaries and their social reforms and their public spending. And so through some investigations and inquiries that he was performing to cause them trouble, it was actually Mrs. Macquarie who designed it was not Greenway, but Mrs. Macquarie who designed the fountain. Although the height was dropped, but both times you see these important numbers coming again. So not only did she design it, but her original plan had this magic four-dimensional number 288, and even when it was reduced, it still remained 144, but on the Cremona scale. Now as we move along, we come a short distance away is a sculpture, A Folly for Mrs. Macquarie, which was installed in 2000. Much symbolism in the sculpture itself, but also tells a story very much of Mrs. Macquarie's opinions and her liberal mindedness, especially for the time. The symbols, even you can read this plaque here, if you pause it you might be able to read it more, but it discusses how she saw the division, how the colonialisation of Australia was moving in a violent way, in a divisive way, with both her and her husband surprisingly open-minded and trying to be inclusive of the native population. Their policies were complete opposite to what most would expect, and a complete opposite to what was happening at the time. It's quite a story in itself, but the dagger on the top is a family crest, a Macquarie crest, and the dagger points to her Argyll in England, where she died and is buried, whereas her husband's Macquarie was buried in Ulva, Scotland, near to his birthplace. Further down, a very famous spot in Sydney, Mrs. Macquarie's chair, which is at the end of Mrs. Macquarie's road. Mrs. Macquarie designed the road, and well, you might think what's so special about a road, but the road is a curvy one, and you might think, well, there's not much to be hidden in there. There's not much information. There's certainly not anything to do with Hermetic thought or esoteric thought or this type of thing. But it's weights and measures are the key, and by understanding that, you see that even in this very simple construction, a road, which is actually quite profound because like bridges, it joins people together. It's an important thing. But the road, most of the road has been removed. A large part of it has been changed now, but some parts of it are still there. So as you walk through the domain, you pass the art gallery, but there's a section of the road remaining which is right next to Mrs. Macquarie's chair, which was, most people, Sydney-siders would know, was her favourite spot to sit and to watch and to contemplate things. Beautiful view of the harbour, and and quite simple, but still a lot of information in there. And for instance, it's 3 miles and 777 yards. Now, she designed that with a very specific intention, and there are many connections through ancient times and through modern times, but especially all throughout Sydney, and very strong connections to esoteric groups, the Freemason and Oddfellow especially. But 3 Steps in itself is an important reference as well. But most importantly is the length of the road and how it was even carved, that the carving, and it was written and recorded down, 3 miles and 377 yards, or 5,280 yards and 377 yards. This was done early 1816, and it's an iconic piece of Sydney. Another iconic piece of Sydney is the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is 5,280 inches high, 52,800 tonnes of steelwork, and 3,770 feet long in total length. Designed by John Bradfield, Freemason, who again, these numbers will find all across the world, and beginning with Mrs. Macquarie, who was a very, very smart lady and very overlooked for her significance in Sydney. So the Harbour Bridge will connect to this, but so will the Sydney Opera House, and another iconic piece of Sydney, which is 377 feet wide. So again, we're seeing these constant references to 377, in Sydney, beginning with Mrs. Macquarie, but also the AMP building in Sydney, which is another landmark, one of the early skyscrapers in Sydney itself, 377 feet, which connects back to where I mentioned earlier, the Macquarie Place and the fountain which she designed, which now has a statue of Thomas Sutcliffe Maud on top, who was one of the founders of the AMP Society, Australian Mutual Provident Society, a self-help, a mutual aid society, and people a little bit older might remember how well respected and how important it was, and to helping people across Australia. But back to Goulburn, which I've been mentioned in earlier episodes regarding Edmund Blackett and James Barnett. We see the building here. You might think it's relatively simple colonial building, but in itself has symbolism all across it, from the corbels, keystones above the windows, which connect back to the Corinthian order, but also on top where we have the sculpture, and most specifically the cornucopia, but even the lanterns which are there, which is another classic symbol on the tracing boards. But the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, one of these, it's all over the place. But yeah, the horn of plenty, like literally, it's overflowing with fruit and with produce, and it's discussing it, to be the food reference, but it's to be rich with and plentiful and a good harvest. And there's another double cornucopia there on either side of the emblem above the main door in that Goulburn building. Thomas Sutcliffe Mort was a Freemason. Francis Greenway, who gets the credit for so much, was a Freemason, but it was actually Elizabeth Macquarie who did the design of the fountain, which was very important for people in the colony to get clean water. It wasn't just about making things pretty. It was an important piece of public infrastructure. So basically, standing in front of the Sydney Opera House, and as we scan around, we come back to the AMP building, and back to the iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House. 377 feet high, the AMP building. Strong connections to Freemasonic and to mutual aid societies. The Sydney Harbour Bridge, total length 3,770 feet long. Mrs. Macquarie's Road, 377 yards, and the Sydney Opera House, 377 feet wide. clearly this is a very important number, and it's one of those ones that goes deeper. As you peel back the layers, you find this number, and then you simply follow the trail, and you'll see how important it is. Also, the Mrs. Macquarie's chair, the elevation is 33 feet. If you think that's a coincidence, considering everything else, well, good luck to you, because it's not. She designed this with the aid of her husband, which brought it in, but it was her design. As with the fountain, she was very clever and very smart. But 33 feet being a classic Freemasonic symbol, the House of a Temple in Washington, the Lincoln Memorial, has with her 528 and 33 yards high. So 528 and 33 feet wide. Again, the cathedral in Brasilia by Oscar Niemeyer has 33 and 528. The Scottish Rite Cathedral in Indianapolis, another a touchdown I've keep coming back to, because just the importance of these numbers and how it's built into these these secret societies. The allegory of New Jerusalem, 528 and 33 references across there, as well as being a harmony point across multiple forms of measurement. Colonial Williamsburg, the original capital of North America, 5,280 and 33 yards. Just as with Mrs. Macquarie's chair, this simple architecture full of profound knowledge, of deep knowledge which you need, that peels back. Windsor, for instance, the blocks have this Pythagorean knowledge built into it, as also all the other lovely numbers, but 33 and 528 has where his roads also contain the 5 proportion, as in the Great Pyramid, the carriageway against the width of the road, which brings us back to Chicago. I've talked about an Anish Kapoor and the Cloudgate statue, which has those exact 5 proportions, has in the roads laid out by Lachlan Macquarie, 33 feet and 66 feet, like connects both to Lachlan Macquarie and to Elizabeth Macquarie. However, in the for the London Olympics, the sculpture that Anish Kapoor sculpture, again 377 feet high. There's 4 references in 4 very important structures in Sydney, and also here. So again, 528 reference and 3,770, and on the Sydney Harbour Bridge by the architect John Bradfield, who was again part of a secret society, Mutual Aid Society. It's not the spooky thing, but the Bronx Whitestone Bridge in New York. The towers, 377 feet high, the total length, exactly like the Sydney Harbour Bridge, 3,770 feet. The George Washington Bridge, we see the cable stays in the from the cabling to and relative to the height of the towers to the deck, 377 feet. New York, the Manhattan Bridge, I mentioned in an earlier episode, full of these lovely numbers, this secret occult knowledge which relates to sun, earth and moon and geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and musical properties as well. But we see Hellgate Bridge on the top from New York as well, which was an early version which inspired the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Connections, it has no end. We stay in Washington, the Statue of Liberty, 7 diadems, 11-pointed star at the bottom, but 370 steps to the from the lobby to the crown. Frederic Bartholdi was the architect, and you get a reference straight away with his hand placement. Another structure I've been talking about, I want to go into deeper, which again is full of this type of this secret knowledge, is the Voortrekker Monument in South Africa. There are 377 steps from the entrance to reach the monument itself, and so again, it's connection to another one. The heights of that as well, it's 528 palm wide, so it's a 528 reference, but touchstone building I've keep coming back to as well across Paris is the Eiffel Tower. The second level is 377 yards. So I covered previously the meaning of the first level and the base, sun, earth and moon, but and the height as well, which profound knowledge. It was a temporary structure originally, but such as a Galerie de Machines for international, the Universal Exhibition. This was a temporary structure, and it was demolished in 1910. But it was the longest unsupported ceiling at the time, 377 feet long. Eiffel Tower was meant to be temporary, but luckily it was maintained and is still there, an icon building of the world and especially of France. Chartres Cathedral, classic, one of the fundamentals of understanding this type of architecture and the secret knowledge contained therein, 377 feet high. Many cathedrals have this, I'll just touch on this one, and Reims Cathedral, for instance, the nave is 377 feet as well. So all these cathedrals, even though they're different sizes, different forms, different shapes, will have the same numbers or the same numeric symbolism in one form or another, the same numbers in the metrology, but just, they'll just move it around. It's not a strict template, it's about a very clever design. The Gates of Europe, as it's also known, the towers are 377 feet, the first inclined skyscrapers, creating a 30-degree or 108,000 second angle between them, as well as there's a reference to shipping and navigation on the sculpture, which you can see there in the front, in the middle, because this number 377 goes throughout history, especially regarding ships. Warramunga was an Australian Navy ship built in Australia, just a short distance away from the Sydney Harbour Bridge and Sydney Opera House. It was 377 feet long. The Virginia-class submarines, 33 feet wide, is what the standard for them, but it is the USS Washington is 377 feet long. There's a long tradition with going back to the Civil War and even earlier in the Americas to occult knowledge and the use of these numbers. Polaris, this is a yacht owned by Roman Abramovich, famous billionaire. Billionaires love this knowledge and they use it all the time. So 377 feet long, and you'll find it elsewhere. The very rich and elite know about this and they use it all the time. In New York, the Peking, it's now a museum ship permanently moored, 377 feet long. If you search the history of shipping, you'll find this reappearing over and over again in wooden ships, but also in the modern age, in the most modern, most technological ships of all, such as Virginia-class submarines. Back to ancient times, Greeks and Romans, they built massive ships, and one of them, this very famous one, 66 feet high and 377 feet long. You can't call this coincidence. This is a plan. It's a template. Another important thing in Sydney is there's an Artemis statue in the Hyde Park fountain, the Archibald Fountain, which looks up Macquarie Street, which is 66 feet wide, proportion set by Macquarie. But the Temple of Artemis, this is a reconstruction, 377 feet long. The third temple was paid for by the King Croesus of Lydia. Very important alchemical connections. They were the first people to be able to separate electrum, silver and gold, into coinage and have pure gold coins. Stonehenge Phase 1, I'm including this because it will be contentious because of there'll be issues around this, but it's still worth a mention because I've talked about Stonehenge and it's 108 feet diameter and how this is across stone circles in England and ancient structures around the world. So, Mrs. Macquarie, a road of 3 miles and 377 yards. The AMP building, 377 feet. the Sydney Opera House 377 feet, and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This number, it's a thing. This is an important piece of the puzzle. So I often talk about the Pythagorean 108, 144, etc., which are wonderful numbers, but they're the surface layer. And as you start peeling back, you'll get to 33, to 528, and to 792, which I talked earlier. But as we go even deeper and deeper, 377 will start to appear. And its connections are very important, and it has very significant meaning because it relates directly to the golden ratio, or phi, because it's a Fibonacci number. Most people would have heard of the Fibonacci numbers, but 377 is the 14th Fibonacci number. So what's so special about the number 377, and especially how it being a Fibonacci number, is the golden ratio, or the divine proportion, the golden mean, most just often referred to as phi. It's a beautiful geometric construction, but it's also something that flows throughout nature, from the micro to the macro, from the biggest to the smallest, in life, but in the galaxies, and down to the subatomic level. This proportion is something which is often dismissed, but more and more even the mainstream is having to accept it, because even in astronomy and throughout nature, it's simply it's a mathematical fact, and there's a bit of hate about it, and it's strange how certain gatekeepers go out of their way to try and diminish it, and to say that it doesn't exist when it does. It's simply a fact. But throughout this series and the architecture I've been discussing, and this proportion, and even how it goes back to the ancient times, the Great Pyramid reflects pi in multiple forms, as a ratio, but also as a measurement, and it's simply one of the most beautiful constructions in geometry. It's just awesome. But in Sydney, just a short distance behind the Opera House, and just off Macquarie Street, a reference again to the Macquaries, there is a sculpture there. And from ground level, it wouldn't make much sense. It's just a bunch of old building bits and pieces that have been laid out on the ground. But when viewed from above, it starts to tell the same story as what Mrs. Macquarie was passing onto us, and what these other architects from the ancient to the modern times have been passing on to us. This beautiful proportion, phi. The sculpture itself is memory is creation without end, and we can see here how it's very close to the AMP building, which is directly right behind the Customs House, which I commented on in the James Barnett episode. So now we zoom in, we see Macquarie Street, and we see the sculpture there, and it's just all these small pieces of old buildings that have been torn down but placed together, and when you trace them out, they form this spiral, the golden ratio, the divine proportion. It's in shells, it's in sunflowers, it's in hurricanes, it's in the shape of galaxies. It's if you ever do get a chance to visit Sydney, one of the must-do things, apart from the Opera House, Harbour Bridge, and Mrs. Macquarie's chair, is to go to Circular Quay. Just a short stroll from the sculpture Memory is Creation Without End, which is a phi spiral. It's a lovely trip across the harbour. It's certainly one of the most beautiful harbours, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And as we take the ferry across, here we can see the map, and at the top we get an aerial view of the shell spiral, and also the paving at the front of the Manly Wharf. So again, you're right out the door of Manly Wharf from the ferry, and you have this shell sculpture, another reference to phi. Artists throughout, for centuries at least, but going back a long time, and architects have been using this golden ratio, phi and the spiral, because they saw it in sunflowers, they saw it in shells, and they saw how the proportions of it make such beautiful art and architecture. Now we get back on the Manly ferry as it cuts its way to Circular Quay. So as the Manly Ferry heads back towards Sydney, this is the view we'd get. The Opera House, the Harbour Bridge, Mrs Macquarie's chair, and the AMP building. That might not make the list, but by understanding the esoteric principles, the Hermetic arts, and how this occult thinking has so many layers and has so many aspects, so and more than just the physical aspects of the architecture and the numbers and these proportions, Mrs Macquarie's also left us a wonderful legacy, as equal to her husband. So we're not going to call her second rate to Lachlan Macquarie. She's very much part of this, and she's very much Lachlan Macquarie is described as the father of Australia. We could describe Mrs Macquarie as the mother of Australia. So as we finish off, I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned something. I'm sure even Sydney-siders would be surprised to learn a few of these things. And please be sure to check the descriptions. I'll make sure to put up the most relevant links, especially to the architects James Barnett and Edmund Blackett, and to Lachlan Macquarie, and the importance that they've had on the development of the city of Sydney, but also the nation of Australia. So with a tip of a hat to Mrs Macquarie, I'll be ending this video and say thank you for watching, and do check the links for the related videos. Thank you.